Hello, welcome to this virtual tour of Mill Road Cemetery in Cambridge. This is part of the Open Cambridge series of events and is done by Mill Road History Society. I'm Jo Costin and I'll be your guide for the day. So here we are on the Avenue of Limes. This is the main entrance to the cemetery coming in off Mill Road. In its Victorian heyday, this would have been a very elaborate and beautiful avenue for the hearses to come down, usually horse-drawn hearses, obviously. The site itself was opened in 1848, having been acquired in 1847 the year before. It was a result of collaboration between 13 different parishes in Cambridge, as their burial grounds had begun to become quite full. This was particularly the case following the cholera epidemic in 1831. People were beginning to get quite concerned about how shallow some of the graves were, and there was a lot of concern about whether that was contributing to disease. So the search began for a suitable place to put a graveyard. As with many things that the city and university didn't want to think too much about, it ended up on Mill Road. Mill Road is also the home of the workhouse and various other things like the Infectious Diseases Hospital. Essentially, if you didn't want it messing up the pretty city centre, you put it on Mill Road. At the time when the cemetery was first consecrated, Mill Road area was mostly open fields, although the railway had arrived fairly recently into Cambridge. The cemetery itself was laid out by Andrew Murray, who was also known for laying out the Botanic Gardens. And the paths in the cemetery have recently been resurfaced, so that was result of some funding from Section 106 money, and they were dedicated on the 9th of March 2019 by Bishop Reilly, with the Mayor and the Choir of Great St Mary's in attendance. So we're going to head on up the path into the cemetery, and I will stop again at the next grave. Mill Road Cemetery has a number of listed graves, and some of them are in this corner over here. So there's one right here which you can see, which has a very nice carved figure of a lady at the front, and in the back over there, which unfortunately you can't see today because of the brambles, is a very beautifully carved and elaborate cross. These two graves here are the graves for the Kett family. So at the back, George and Sarah Kett are buried in that grave. So George Kett was born in 1809 and died in 1872. In the late 1830s, he was working on Norwich Cathedral, where he met James Ratty, who was also a builder and carpenter. Together they set up the firm Ratty and Kett, which became a well-known Cambridge building firm in 1843. The grave at the back is made of white marble with green marble inserts, and if you come to the cemetery and it's slightly less covered in brambles, it's a very beautiful grave to look at. There's also pictures on the website, Mill Road Cemetery website, which you can have a look at. This grave at the front is for Elizabeth and George Kett. There were quite a lot of George Ketts, 3 in a row in fact. So George Kett at the back was the grandfather of the George Kett in this grave at the front. So George Kett was in London, he was born in Cambridge but he moved to London, where he worked as an apprentice chemist and druggist. He later returned to Cambridge after marrying Elizabeth in 1884 and took up work in the family building firm. During the First World War, he was very involved in the National Service Committee and also in the Cambridge Food Control Committee. The Food Control Committee basically worked out the details of how rationing worked on a local level. So although people tend to think of rationing as something in the Second World War, it did also take place in the First World War as well. And interestingly, a lot of the pressure for rationing to be introduced came from the people upwards rather than the government imposing something. So if you read the newspaper reports of the committee, there's a lot of calls for them to do more and to ration milk and butter and eggs a lot more than they were doing and ensure that food was distributed fairly. Here we have the grave of Robert Sale. Robert Sale was quite famous locally, so some of those of you who may have lived in Cambridge a lot longer than me might remember Sale's shop. Sales is where John Lewis now is, and the firm was actually taken over by John Lewis. Robert Sale was born in 1816. He initially worked in London, where he learnt a lot about running a retail business. He came back to Cambridge and opened his own store in 1840. This was a drapery business. He used a lot of ideas that he'd got from London, which were very innovative for the time. So, for example, he had large shop windows displaying goods and marked prices on all of the items, which reduced the need for haggling. This was quite an unusual thing to have at the time, even though these are things that we now take for granted when we're going shopping. He suffered a fatal heart attack in 1883 when he was aged 67. What you can also see while I'm stood here is that there's a lot of brambles, long grass, a lot of vegetation and wildlife. You might see some butterflies or hear some birdsong. Mill Road Cemetery, as well as being a cemetery, was also a city wildlife site, and some of the trails on our website focus on that instead of on the graves. So if you want to come to the cemetery and have a look around, and you're more interested in the plants and the animals that live here rather than the people who are buried here, why not take a look at those as well? Okay, we're now standing in the centre of Mill Road Cemetery in what's known as the centre circle. Initially, when the cemetery was built, there was no chapel, and bodies were brought in and temporarily laid to rest in the lodge, which is at the top of the Avenue of Limes. However, this wasn't ideal. The lodge was quite cramped and not perfectly suited to this purpose, so it was decided to build a chapel, a mortuary chapel in the centre of the cemetery. And so for a while on this spot there stood a beautiful chapel. However, there was frequent issues with maintenance, and in 1938, when the cemetery was being closed, so the cemetery itself is now closed, which means that unless you've got family members buried here in a family plot, you can't be buried here any longer. They basically stopped maintaining the chapel. It continued to be used occasionally until 1949, but then sadly in 1954 a fire broke out and the structure became unsafe, and so it was demolished. In 2017, the sites of the chapel, the foundations, were marked out by York stone, which has been carved with the names of the parishes, with an inscription and with the dates of George Gilbert Scott. This was dedicated on the 14th of January 2017, and the font itself was specially designed for the project by a local ARU student, Siobhan Brown, who designed the font based on some of the fonts in the graveyard, and named it Cordelia Gothic after the wife of William Whewell. Speaking of gravestones and fonts, come and have a look at these gravestones over here. You can see that there's a couple of different ways that you might carve or mark a headstone. So this one here has little metal letters. These look great and they're fantastic until the pins give out and they fall off, at which point it becomes very difficult to tell what it originally said. This stone here has a different problem. As you can see, it's been made from a very soft stone and has become very eroded. So we're now at one of the parish boundary stones here. These little stones mark the division between the different parishes. So you may have heard me mention this a few times, but Mill Road Cemetery isn't the burial ground for just one parish in Cambridge. It's actually the burial place for 13 different parishes. So those parishes are St Andrew the Less, All Saints, St Edward King and Martyr, St Botolph's, St Mary the Less, St Andrew the Great, St Michael, St Clement's, St Benedict, Holy Sepulchre, St Mary the Great, Holy Trinity and St Paul. So these 13 parishes had basically run out of space in their city centre areas, and they needed to find somewhere else to bury their dead. That's where Mill Road Cemetery came in. All the different plots are marked out by these little markers, and as you go around you might see differences in the character of the graves in different plots, different parish areas. So for example, at the very top, in the area of St Andrew the Less, there's very few grave markers still surviving. That's because this was a very poor area of Cambridge, and so what happened was either there was no markers at all, or they were wooden markers, and these have now been lost. One of the things that Mill Road Cemetery is doing is we're trying to map all of the monuments in the cemetery. So the way we're doing that is we've got some help from Tim from the Ordnance Survey, and he comes along when he can with a giant zapper thing. It's the best way to describe it. And we get accurate GPS readings for all the different monuments in the cemetery. This does take quite a bit of time, as you can imagine. Some of the other areas that you've seen on this tour are very overgrown, which makes it difficult to find exactly where the graves are. But we're doing our best, and if you go on the website you will find the current map which shows all the little dots where the graves have been accurately plotted, and all the graves that have been plotted in that way have their latitude and longitude coordinates, and those coordinates also include these little boundary stones so that you can see exactly which graves are in which parish boundary. Okay, this is the grave of James Reynolds. He was the stagecoach driver from Cambridge to London. He was born in 1795 and died in 1868. He was also known as Jem Reynolds. As well as being a stagecoach driver, he found his true calling as an amateur dramatist and was very well loved by many. One day, after winning a foot race across Parker's Piece, he was apparently very fleet of foot, his friend composed an epitaph which he said should be read for him. So, here we go. Reader, pause o'er this here tomb, and ere thou departest, know 'tis Jem Reynolds, not Sir Joshua the artist, the man so renowned for his telegraph driving, that none could surpass him, dead or surviving. He was the beau of the road and the pride of the fair, sat his box with a grace that was quite debonair. By nature created bold, active and strong, in a foot race or leap he was first in the throng. He could skate like a fenman and a somersault fling, and he was a crack shot at a bird on the wing. He would ride like a Nimrod, like a Peyton could drive. He could swim like Leander, like a pearl hunter dive. Act Iago and Sherlock, like Incledon sing. He could fence with old Angelo, or box with Tom Spring. He could dance the gavotte too with aerial grace, like Proteus could change, but was always in place. Lords, dons and doctors, all the choice spirits, acknowledged his worth and rewarded his merits. Integrity, candour and truth stamped the man, and he honoured the like. Okay, we're now at the grave of Emmarolfe, who died aged 16. She was murdered on Midsummer Common on the 24th of August 1876 by Robert Browning, former soldier. Emmarolfe was born in Barnwell and worked in a well-known brothel on Crispin Street. On the 24th of August, she was seen going on to Midsummer Common with Robert Browning. Shortly afterwards, people heard a shriek. Police Constable Joseph Wheel went out to see what had happened, and Browning ran into him and said that he had just murdered a woman. He led him straight to the body, and Emma was found with her throat cut. Over 2,000 people attended the funeral here in Mill Road Cemetery, and the vicar presiding took the opportunity to warn people about the dangers of immoral lifestyles and advise them to change their ways. He was tried on the 29th of November, found guilty, and his plea of insanity was rejected. He was hanged on the 15th of December 1876 at Cambridge Borough Jail, which is on the southeast corner of Parker's Piece, roughly where the YMCA and the car park is today. So as well as having lots of graves and being a city wildlife site, Mill Road Cemetery is also home to the sculpture trail. There are 7 sculptures done by Gordon Young scattered around the cemetery. There's 6 stone ones like this one here. This is the Robin stone, and there's 1 wooden bench. These have all been carved to kind of mimic the style of writing on the gravestones, and they celebrate the birds and wildlife that can be found in the cemetery. Each one has perches for birds to rest on, and on the top there's an indent so that water will be collected for the birds to drink. So the really nice thing about the bird stones in the cemetery is that they kind of link the 2 halves of what the cemetery has to offer. They link the history with the kind of imagery of the gravestones and the sort of poetic inscriptions, and they also celebrate the wildlife that lives here now. We're now at the grave of Arthur Reginald Chapman, who was in the Royal Artillery in the Second World War. This is one of 19 Commonwealth War Graves Commission headstones which can be found in the cemetery. If you're interested in seeing the rest, there's a trail which will take you round them. Arthur was born in 1888 and he served in the First World War in India in the cavalry. In the Second World War he immediately rejoined but joined the Royal Artillery, where he was in the light anti-aircraft unit. He was a captain and in command of a gun of the anti-aircraft unit. He was injured in a road traffic accident, collision between an army lorry and a car. Road traffic accidents in the Second World War were more common than you might think, especially as a result of the blackout. It's not clear from the inquest or from the documents that I've been able to find whether this was a blackout-related accident or not. However, he died of his injuries and was buried here in Mill Road Cemetery, leaving a widow and 2 sons. We're now at the grave of Frederick Tudor Hall, also known as Funny Fred Hall. Funny Fred was a popular Victorian children's entertainer, well known for his troupe of donkeys. A review of his acts in the Glasgow Evening Post in 1888 said, "He carries a mop and says nothing else but mop, 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 all night long," which somewhat affected the gallery. Fred became very funny later on, when, with a face full of unspeakable woe, he goes about pretending to assist everybody and really doing nothing at all. Funny Fred Hall is probably one of the more interesting stories on the website. There's a fantastic picture, go and have a look, of him in his clown get-up. We're now at the grave of John Edward Langworthy, who's another of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. This particular one is quite unusual because he was a munitions worker from Australia. He was brought over to England to help in the munitions factories because most of the young Englishmen had gone off to fight in the war. Australian munition workers were eligible for Commonwealth War Graves Commissions because they've been recruited as a body and posted overseas. What a lot of people think about when they think of the First World War is they think about tribunals and about young men being sent off against their will, or the kind of bad treatment of conscientious objectors. What you find if you start reading the actual papers of local tribunals in the newspapers is that often most of the cases were relating to people making claims for economic or family reasons and not for conscience reasons. Even in Cambridge, which had quite a high number of conscientious objectors because of the university, the vast majority of cases heard in the tribunal were to do with economic or social reasons and not to do with conscience. One of the people who appealed to the tribunal was in fact one of the sextons at Mill Road Cemetery, who appealed on the basis that he was doing 2 to 3 burials a week and nobody else could do his job, and it was vital that he carried on. He was in fact granted that permission to stay. Thank you very much for joining me on this tour. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'd also like to thank Jim Costin, who's been behind the camera for this.
Hello.
And to say a thank you to the Friends of Mill Road Cemetery. Much of their research has been behind this talk, and you can find it all on our website, millroadcemetery.org. Thank you very much.